Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. This webinar is one that I did some time ago, and it was actually requested by not just our therapist at Evoke, but also by parents at Evoke. I think there's a special challenge and quality and sweetness between the relationship between a father and a son that I think it deserves its own attention. And while all of our relationships with all of our children, whether we're fathers or mothers, is important and just as important as the others, I think, like I said, there are special issues that we can talk about today and the way that we're raising our young men, and especially as fathers. So, with that preamble, let me talk about four overarching themes that I'll be talking about today. First of all, just for the needed presence. I think historically in our culture and in our community, fathers have been relegated to the role of provider. And in fact, many fathers I've talked to, especially those from previous generations, have said that their entire success, how they measure their success as a father, was by how well or if they were able to provide for their sons. And I'm speaking of financially. And while that can be one of the many roles, one of the many hats that a father plays, some of the information and research that I'm going to share with you tonight illustrates the amazing impact that an involved father can have in a child's life. So presence is important. Showing up is important. Vulnerability, being able to model vulnerability. I think that that's one of the greatest gifts that a father can give to his son is the ability to show up vulnerable, to share emotions, to talk about making mistakes, to be able to apologize. And I'll talk about that in contrast to the idea that I think many of us fall into the trap of as fathers, which is that's having this old-fashioned kind of guy's guy relationship with a child where competition becomes a part of it. Banter, sarcasm, condescending, one up and one down, intimidating, all those can be features that are actually celebrated in manhood in our culture. And I'm going to share this story early on tonight because it was profound to me to discover that in my own therapy some years ago, I discovered through sharing some stories, some examples with my therapist, she made the comment, "It sounds like your father was competing with you." And I'd never thought of it that way, not once. But that really resonated with me. And what was more difficult to come to terms with was years later, just a couple of years ago, I realized that I have, in ways, been involved with my son and our relationship together in a very similar kind of way. Who was right? Who could win? Right? One-upsmanship. And so I'm not proud of that. It's something that when I discovered it, it hit me with a great deal of shame. But it can be something in our culture that's celebrated and encouraged in manhood and in masculinity. And of course, in the parent-child relationship, it can be toxic and harmful. But like I said in my own story, I discovered that I too was doing the thing that for me was very painful as a child. Listening is going to be a big theme tonight. I think sometimes we fathers like to think of ourselves as teachers, lecturers. I know I do. And a lot of fathers, I've had more than one father share with me that part of his goal in sending his son to Evoke was to get his son in a place where he would be ready and willing and able to listen to the wisdom that the father has to offer, right? That they would be open to that information, that wisdom that when the child was younger, perhaps they were willing to listen to. And what I say to fathers is that's not the real goal of this process. The real goal, the real healing is going to happen as you improve your ability to listen and to see your son, your children. That's going to make the biggest impact and the biggest difference. And I won't go off on this for too long, but I will say that that's the most important factor in many ways in creating resiliency in children is to be seen and to be heard by somebody consistently in their life, at least one consistent adult in their life. So those are a few of the overarching themes as we launch into tonight's broadcast. I'm going to start off with some questions that fathers have posed to me. How can fathers navigate the challenging balance of work outside the home and finding time for their sons? I think it's a challenge no matter whether you're a father or a son. And the temptation is, and I see this so much even in my own field, but at work, things just work. It's actually a lot easier. You get rewarded and reinforced and admired and respected and listened to at work, right? There are a lot of reinforcers at work. At work, you ask for a pencil and somebody hands you a pencil. You ask for a pencil at home and somebody hands you a marshmallow. And the mistake that we can make is that if we don't do enough of our own work to feel good enough about ourselves, we will find ourselves looking for that reinforcement, for that validation more and more and more at work. So I'll try to explain an idea around this that I've observed as I work with fathers. The key to parenting in some ways is not to convince yourself that you're great, not to be told how amazing you are, and that somehow when you hear that or believe that you'll feel good about yourselves. The fact of the matter is we all know that we're human. We all know that we make lots of mistakes. And so when somebody tells us how great we are as a person or a father, for most of us it feels disingenuous in many ways because we know the truth. And we know that if they really saw all of us, the behind the scenes footage, that they would know that we know we're not great. So the key is not convincing or believing that you're great or amazing. The key is recognizing that you're human and that you make mistakes. And when you accept that, when that becomes something you can sit with, it doesn't abdicate you from responsibility for trying and showing up and trying to improve, but when you can accept your humanity, your limitations, your faults, your issues, when you can accept that, then you don't need to go out looking for it at work. And you can show up at home where the kids, as we all know, aren't going to think you're all that great sometimes. And nobody's going to be there to praise you or give you Manager of the Month award, Salesman of the Year award, right? Tell you how great you are for saving their child's life, like I get told sometimes by people. So I have to make peace with myself so that I won't be drawn to and intoxicated by that attention from others outside of the home, so that I can show up and be there for my family. So I think part of finding that balance is finding a deeper, more authentic sense of yourself. And if we don't do that, we will look for situations that only reinforce our goodness, our greatness. And since our children aren't going to do that all the time, we'll be less and less drawn to them. So again, like I talk about all the time, the foundation of some of the most important work is work on the self. Fathers have the luxury sometimes that mothers don't give themselves, which is, there aren't a lot of articles, for example, in popular culture about fathers balancing work and home. But there are a lot of articles and celebrities that talk about it, the challenge of mothers balancing work and home, working mothers balancing that. We get a pass, right? We don't have to be as balanced, culturally speaking. Not according to child development or therapists, but that's what our culture tells us. And so again, it takes extra effort, concentration, and intention to say, I'm going to spend some more time with my children because we get that free pass. The next question that was sent to me, how can fathers overcome their own lack of emotional development and connect emotionally with their sons? I had a father say to me one time, and I've shared this story before, after doing some education at a parent support group, he said, so what you're saying is that our histories as children, how we were parented, how we grew up, that largely impacts how we show up as a father. And I almost chuckled when he said it out loud because it was so simple and so obvious and so profound at the same time. And I said, yes, that's what we're coping with. I mean, there are other factors, but that's largely what we're all coping with. That's why I really love the book Parenting from the Inside Out. Because the idea in the book, the messages and the research in the book is that if you develop a more clear sense of self, if you heal your own attachment wounds, your own trauma, big T or small t traumas, you're more capable of providing healthy attachment for your child. And so it can be through 12-step groups, through Al-Anon, through Codependence Anonymous, through AA, through therapy, through self-help workshops and efforts. It can be through any means in those areas, but somehow to get to do your work. And because we're taught as fathers to not be vulnerable and to not be weak and to not need help, we're rewarded for how self-sufficient we are, even as little children. We're rewarded and praised for not needing. And our neediness is often shamed, and we're told that we're too much, that we're overwhelming to other people. All of those messages come to us, and so it takes a special kind of courage for a man to go into therapy. I noticed tonight that we have lots of men in attendance, and I think that's fantastic. I get a decent amount of fathers on these webinars, and at times when I do the parent support groups around the country and around North America, I do find that I get a limited number of men, probably about 30%. That's a pretty fair representation. About 30% of the parents that show up are men. And I'll talk, like I said, I'll talk tonight about how critical and important it can be for fathers to show up and how much their presence makes a difference. How can divorced fathers become, the next one asks, how can divorced fathers become more aware of the impact that a girlfriend or step-parent has on their sons and find a way to balance their son's need with their own personal relationship needs? I think this is a special challenge for all of us. I think that I think for any parent, it can become very challenging to be able to distinguish between the parent's needs, what you need, and what your child needs. So I think that's a particular challenge that we all have. And that's why doing your own work is so important, recognizing the difference, and then being able to show up to the child for the child. So that's the first thing, is start to understand what you need. And because you might feel a great deal of affection toward somebody that you're dating, you may want to introduce that person to the child, but that may not be their need. So consulting with others, moving very slowly in the process, and recognize that the introduction of a partner, male or female, to a child, it comes with some risks, because if that happens a lot, and there are a lot of partners that go through the process with you, the child learns not to trust and develops some anxious attachment. I'll tell you something else that's important. Sometimes the new partner represents to the child the final nail in the coffin, that the marriage between his parents is truly dead, or that even accepting that new person in your life, in their life, excuse me, accepting the new person in their life is a betrayal to their mother. Right? There are conflicts of feelings, conflicted feelings, and there's a sense that I can't accept, I can't welcome this person, because in so doing I'm disrespecting and dismissing my mother in the process. And it can happen either way with any gender, but it's just an example of an important thing to pay attention to. And that we allow space for our children to struggle. We can still have boundaries around behavior, but to really, really lean into the emotional world of the child. Somebody once told me that sometimes to understand somebody else, you have to lose your mind. And I think that's most true when it's our children. We have to do our best to psychologically put ourselves in their place and understand what they need instead of what we need or what we needed when we were young. The next question, how can fathers better understand the urgency of getting into their son's world and interests, art, music, video games, sports, etc.? I learned very early in my therapeutic work. I learned that what a child cares about is a part of them. And one of my first teachings of therapy, our therapists told us that if a child brings in, for example, a stuffed animal, that you treat the stuffed animal the way that you would want the child to be treated. You treat it with as much affection and love. There's a technical term for it, but the fact of the matter is that what a child cares about, what any of us care about, is a little bit of us. And so you might not like what they like, but you can understand the idea that in part it represents them. And so how you feel about what they like, at least being curious and respecting it. And by respecting it, again, I don't mean you have to like it in that version of respect, but honor it. And I'll go just a step further. Even when, for example, the music or the art is off-putting to you, because that can happen. Doesn't mean you have to listen to it when you're alone in your car, but there's value in listening to it a little bit. If your son, for example, was listening to angry, misogynistic music, for example, you can have your boundary around that, of course. And what does he identify with in there? Why is he angry? Most of us just get uncomfortable with that and angry with that and have a judgment about that and then set a boundary around that. You're allowed to do that if that's what you want to do. But why is it that, for example, white young men from suburban middle and upper class like gangster rap? They didn't grow up in the inner city, poor. What are they identifying with? And that's a worthy thought, a worthy curiosity to pursue in the process. I used to talk about with my clients, my students, my young men, that when boys are little, they often like T-Rex, right? When I was young, it was T-Rex. I think velociraptors have taken over now, but in essence, they like the most incredible predatorial animal that ever was on the earth. Why does a little boy like a predator like that? Why do they like sharks, great white sharks? And I would talk about the feeling of powerlessness that young boys have, that young children have. And identifying with something so ferocious as a T-Rex gives them a sense, some identity, some feeling of power. Or at least communicate their sense of powerlessness. Then later on in life, they gravitate toward more aggressive music themes, these same boys. It's the same feeling. So honoring it, understanding it, you don't have to like it, you're allowed to set your boundaries around it, but there's so much more value in the end game. And in many cases, when we seek to understand the behavior before we go about trying to change it. I can't tell you how much more clear I am about that today. That understanding our young men, and our young women for that matter, but understanding others, our children, is a more effective and pragmatically helpful road to travel down than just paying attention and reducing everything to behavioral cooperation or not. Somebody asked the question, how can you get your son to talk if he doesn't want to? You know, sometimes it's just developmentally appropriate for a child not to want to talk as much as a parent wants them to talk. So your project is to be safe. Your project is to be patient. Your project is to lecture less and be quiet more. I talk about be the first one to end conversations so that your child knows that when there is a dialogue, it's not going to have to come to some satisfying end for you every time. Yeah, you make one or two statements, you ask some questions, and you walk away. And ask yourself, why might he not be talking? What would be a possible motive for him having a wall up if that's the case? Does he experience invasiveness from his parents? Does he experience them trying to pry him open and not respecting his boundaries? Those are important questions to ask. And sometimes, I had a therapist just tell me this recently, that one of his clients who was struggling to open up, that the client was saying, I'll try better, I'll work harder. And the therapist actually said, it's okay. I get it. I know a little bit about your family background, And this has been a theme for you where people have tried to pry you open. And so I'm going to be patient. And the boy just burst into tears. I remember one of my clients years ago was absolutely gifted in his ability to maintain the wall, to be stubborn and to not let anybody in. And we tried consequences, we tried to be provocative, creative, everything we could do, and he wouldn't open up. And then I heard something from the parents that led me to this idea. I went back and I apologized to him. I said, I'm sorry. I've been doing something to you that other people have done, and I'll be patient. And if you just want to sit here in session and just sit and look at the fire, I'll do that. And I want to tell you that I'm genuinely sorry. I think I've, in the spirit of trying to find out what's going on for your emotional world, I've been abusive. And after a couple of minutes of sitting there, he said, why do you do this job? And he started asking me questions about how I was feeling and what I thought. And that led to a wonderful discussion in that session. And from then on, we had a good relationship. And he kept in touch with me for some years after he left the program. So it's not a guarantee, and I don't want to give you tricks to be clever, to open your son up, but the message is take some time to consider why it might not feel safe for them to open up. Excuse me, my throat was scratching there. The importance of dad. What society has taught us about the role of dad. Dad has been relegated to the observer, the outsider. If you look at Disney films, for example, many of them depict the dad as incompetent. And while that might be art mirroring reality, it also puts dads on the defensive, right? It puts them in the place where they have to prove that they have any value to add. And it might seem harmless. I think we're very well tuned into the harm that has been created by some of the messages in our culture and even some of our children's movies. And I don't think we've paid as much attention to the harm that has been done to fathers. And part of that is because there's been such a difference in power in general in our society that the more vulnerable persons in our society needed more attention and still do. But it doesn't exclude the fact that there are still those messages that fathers are largely incompetent. My own story. I grew up without a father largely. So I had no idea of the importance of a father. I remember I was on a business trip and I was talking to my mother and she said, have you talked to children? I said, not in a few days. And she was alarmed. She said, Brad, you have to, this is when they were very young. My two oldest were very young. 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old. And she said, you have to call them every day if you can. And I thought, I didn't know that would matter. I thought they were okay. Their mother was with them. And she said, that's not enough. That's not all of it. And she explained to me, I know you didn't have a father who was there for you, but it will make a difference. And she was right. And I didn't do it perfectly after that, but it was just, I didn't know. I had to invent the idea of a father for me. And that might not be, you might not have that extreme example in your life, but in some ways we do have to invent or reinvent what it means to be a father, because some of the modeling we got from our fathers and they got from their fathers is far less than ideal. Yeah, I learned in school that fathers are irrelevant. There is a lack of research about fathers compared to mothers. It's profound. In fact, for many, many, many years, they only talked about, when they talked about parenting, they only talked about mothers. And I'm not saying that helped mothers. That put a lot of pressure on them too. But it sent a message to father that they're irrelevant. In fact, as they shifted from realizing they should be talking about both parents, they actually called fathers who were the primary caregivers for children functional mothers. Can you imagine? The early research, they thought it was clever to use the term functional mother when describing a father who was a primary caregiver, or it could be a grandparent for that matter. That's how irrelevant and outside the fathers were made to feel. I talked about the idea of work and home, about the temptation. In our culture, mothers have the pressure that how the children are doing is a reflection of them. Still, that's a theme. It's not universally true, but it's still a theme. Mothers take on more. Their esteem is based more on how the children are doing, whereas fathers, they tend to, their value tends to be, again, in the provider role. And so they're going to seek to be reinforced in that area. I'll talk about how we can gently invite fathers back into the relationship without shaming them further. And the difficulty between the relationship we have with employees and coworkers and our children. I think one of the beautiful messages that our children are sent to teach us as fathers is what you do at work won't work at home. This relationship you have with me, the children are saying, our sons are saying, is not the same relationship that you have with your employees at work, those you supervise. I think that's a really important message. The work relationship is based on power differential. I mean, good bosses have good relationships, healthy relationships with their employees that are appropriate, but there still is a power differential that defines the employee-employer relationship, boss-supervisor relationship. And our children don't want to be seen as objects, don't want to be seen as something that can be controlled. So they will enter into a power struggle with fathers to prove that I don't care how successful you are, I don't care how much people listen to you, I don't care how much people respect you at work. I want to be seen as a person. I don't want to be your employee or a mere extension of you. How we communicate with our children, how we communicate with our sons is very important. Like I said, being able to model communication skills, particularly vulnerability, but also listening. Listening. So many fathers have told me that they're good listeners because at work they can listen well to others and communicate effectively. Whereas their sons have said, my dad's not a good listener. And then, after doing some of the work that we all asked to do in this work, I have many fathers saying, this is a different skill, a different quality. I'm not listening to respond. I'm listening to understand. Right? Somebody told me one time that the opposite of listening is waiting. I thought that was clever. The opposite of listening is waiting. So the kind of listening that we talk about in families and in relationships that makes a big difference is a different quality, a different kind of listening than the listening we have to do in a classroom or in a workspace. Fathers tend to be in our culture more protective of their daughters and more competitive with their sons. And they role model in a lot of ways just how to be. If they're willing to let down walls and barriers, ask for help, if they get comfortable with their needs, if they can be sensitive and feeling beings, it leaves an impact on the child. My son said to me when he was younger, my oldest child said to me when he was younger, he says, I love watching you watch me ski. And I thought that was such an interesting, he must have been about 12 years old at the time. And I thought that's an amazing attention to detail, to observation. He's watching how I watch him. And while it might not always be that conscious, I think they pay attention to how we regard them, how we think and feel about them. As I talk about in my book, really the inner voice that we all have is not what our parents said to us, not completely. It's how they felt and what they thought about us. Fathers want humility and submission, while adolescent boys have a conflicting need of developing strength, control, and power. Right? It's inconvenient for us that our children aren't compliant. I had a very successful, career-wise, very successful friend of mine tell me one time, everybody listens to me. The only people that haven't listened to me are my teenage children. And we laughed about that and said, that's the way it works, isn't it? And so a lot of relationships, our relationship with our sons, with our children and our sons, if we allow it to, it can create a transformation. We can become more whole, more authentic. I borrowed some of the ideas of this broadcast tonight from the book Raising Cain by Kinlan and Thompson. So I'm going to share a few concepts from their book that talks about raising sons. Something we've read in the field that talks about the emotional world of young men. They said fathers involved in the fabric of the family who show their sons comfort and consistency contribute to their sons' resilience and resourcefulness. The things that contribute to resilience in children is not always what we think it is. It's not about teaching them to be tough. It's about teaching them to feel okay with themselves. So the more time, attention, gentleness that we can offer them, the more that they can feel okay about it, the more they will feel okay about themselves. And that is the feature in a human being that is synonymous with resiliency. If I'm okay, if I know I'm okay, and the way that I learn that is not by you telling me that I'm wonderful. I know that I'm okay because when you're around me, you act as if I'm okay. It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries, that once in a while you don't get upset with me, but fundamentally, you treat me as if I'm okay, even when I'm an idiot. And when I experience that as a human being, as a child growing up, then I believe that I'm okay. If you're frustrated, angry, disappointed, anxious about me fundamentally, I will internalize that as I'm not okay. And that will lead to a lack of resilience and resourcefulness. Kinlan and Thompson also say, our culture's assignment of the relationship work to women has turned emotions into, I'm going to start over. Our culture's assignment of the relationship work to women has turned emotions into a disregarded second language for men. Right? We're not expected to feel. We're not valued for feeling. Right? At work, it's not as valuable to talk about your feelings, to have a lot of emotions. And so it becomes this thing that is not valued in us, in fact, is even frowned upon in us when we are a more complete emotional being. We don't learn how to feel. It's interesting because it starts off very young. When young girls are criticized, they respond to the criticism as if the person criticizing them has a problem with them fundamentally. They worry about the relationship when they're being criticized. When young boys are criticized, they attend to the criticism of the thing or the task at hand. So from a very young age, there's probably some wiring that goes into it. And then that wiring is reinforced by our culture where women are seen as relational beings and men are seen and valued as task accomplishing beings. And again, resistance. There's a value to a child's resistance. And cooperation is not all it's cracked up to be. And that can get in the way between a father and son for sure. More ideas from Raising Cain. It's an older book. So they quote a 1998 article called Daddy Dearest, Do You Really Matter? And they cite that more than 1/3 of children live away from their father. And here's what's amazing, just talking about presence. Studies found that father involvement led to children having higher IQs, reporting healthier on psychological testing, better school performance, and better jobs. And this is a fascinating small detail. Northwestern and University of Michigan in a study reported that the number one biggest predictor that they could find of income at the age of 27 was the father's attendance at PTA meetings. And that might be too big of an extrapolation, but that attendance at a PTA meeting is probably indicative of a quality in the family and a father's involvement, not alienation, but a father's involvement that makes a big difference overall. Learning to meet your child where they're at. Learning to lose your mind. In my book, I talk about this, right, where I'm sitting at a stoplight, and my young daughter, who's now 11, she must have been 6 or 7 at the time, said to me, red means go, green means stop. And I heard her say that and thought, no, I'm going to correct her. I said, no, Livy, green means go and red means stop. And she said, no, Daddy, green means stop and red means go. And there I was thinking all these episodes of Dora the Explorer went wasted. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and she was sitting in the seat behind the passenger seat, low enough that she couldn't see the street light in front of her, the stoplight in front of her. But what she was doing is she was looking out the side window. And in the side window, she was right. When it showed red, we went. And when it showed green, we stopped. And while that might be a trite, silly example, it is learning, attachment is learning to see, to resonate with the child, to understand their world. And it doesn't work in the short game to fix all the problems and all the ills. But in the long run, it is everything. Healthy attachment from two parents, ideally, but at least one, is everything. Becoming interested in their hobbies makes a difference. Listening, of course, they identified that's been talked about already a lot tonight. And avoiding control. I think about the idea about Tony Hawk, the famous skateboarder, and about what it must have been like when he announced to his parents that he wanted to make a living at being a professional skateboarder. And there isn't a lot of room in the world for a lot of professional skateboarders, right? So the example might have limited generalization with regard to skateboarding, but it's the idea of learning to value, honor the child's dream, the child's ideas, even if we know those ideas are for a time going to be a struggle, going to lead to challenge and some failure. My son called me tonight, actually, to ask me about career advice. And so I'm listening to him talk about, he's in his master's degree, and he's talking about an internship this summer, and he's presenting a couple of options to me. I'm thinking in my mind, what's the more conservative option? Which one might I take? As I'm thinking about that, I realized, and I said this to him, I said, although I might have a preference, here are the principles involved, sometimes choosing the other one, you're going to learn just as much. You might just learn just as much from this other one that I think might not be as good of a fit, but there are lessons in that also. And in the end, I didn't really tell him what to do or tell him what I would do. I just reflected back what he was sharing and what he was discovering, and posed the value to him of making the one that might not have been the more conventional choice. Mothers supporting fathers. The idea sometimes, again, of relegating the father outside of the home. Now, a lot of mothers might be saying, wait a second, I have no desire to raise my children. I want my husband, ex-husband, co-parent to be more involved in their children's lives. So that's true of a lot of people I know. And I have seen parental alienation. I have seen mothers make it difficult. My mother made it difficult at times. My father didn't do what he needed to do, but she didn't make it easy for him. And sometimes that's just the anger and jealousy that's there, but it can do real harm in the long run. Be careful in criticizing. Be careful of overcoaching, right? Fathers, I don't feel insecure in my job. I feel comfortable enough in my job that I can make mistakes, that I can own them, that I can apologize, that I can accept critical feedback. That I feel good enough in my job that I can do all of that. But at home, I'm less secure. We all are, really. But us fathers, who have been taught all of our lives that we're not really good at this, we're not really wired for this, it's not natural for us, we can be especially sensitive to criticism. So we practice this, my wife and I, we try. We don't do it perfectly, but we try to give the other person a little bit of space to kind of figure it out themselves and even make some mistakes, and to try to support them. When a mother protects her son, this is from Raising Cain, when a mother protects a son by routinely correcting his father's style to match her own, she diminishes She diminishes the opportunity for genuine and uniquely valuable quality of parenting. I could talk about that with both genders, with both parents, with both genders of children. But again, we're talking about a particular kind of vulnerability for fathers. Polarizing dynamics are when you try to compensate. This is not always true, but a cliche that is often true is the father can be the one emphasizing structure and discipline, and a mother can be the one emphasizing nurturing and connection. And if you're trying to balance each other out, the structure one is saying the mother's being too soft and the mother is saying the father's being too hard, and you get farther and farther and farther apart on the teeter-totter to stay in balance. So just be aware of that. That's why parenting therapy can happen, parenting education can happen, is that you can begin to see how you're creating a polarizing dynamic. This is, again, I'll stop saying this because this is a broadcast about father and sons, but this could go either way. But obsessing about a father, about an ex-husband's negative impact on the child takes you away from what your project is. Now, if the father is abusing the child and you need to take legal action, absolutely do it. But a step down from anything that you can do legally, obsessing, focusing on the father's project doesn't tend to help and leads to often more polarization. So go to Al-Anon if you find yourself obsessing, if you find yourself blaming, if you find yourself constantly thinking about all the ways that dad has hurt the child and how the child is now turning out like the dad in horrible ways. Go to Al-Anon, go to Coda, figure out what your project is, stay on your side of the street, and it will make the biggest difference for the father and his ability to show up and the child in the long run. And then be careful of unhealthy alliances. Turning the child into, mothers turning the child into a co-parent, to an equal, to somebody who takes the place of the co-parent. So what are the take-homes? Moderating vulnerability, empathy, and feeling is critical. It's critical to your son's emotional health and development that he sees a model of a dad who struggles, a dad who hurts, a dad who makes mistakes and has to apologize, a dad who's sad, a dad who needs things. Those are important qualities to be a whole person that you can model. Modeling relationships, focusing on relationships instead of power and control. How do you resolve conflict in ways that aren't just about power and control? Reducing sarcasm. I've even heard, I heard therapists, I never agreed with this, but I've heard therapists talk about the value of sarcasm and connection. Sarcasm is a anxiety relief point. It can be a comedic relief part of life, for sure. But used too much and used with children and fathers using with son, it masks a lot of feelings that are really happening. It masks hurt, sadness, powerlessness, fear, and it masks it with this passive anger. And it's not honest. Watch for polarization with your spouse. Moms can step back a little bit more and let the father and sons sink or swim. Let their relationship be its own. Be careful not to insert yourself. Be careful not to be the safety valve, right? The safety outlet, the facilitator. You can talk to your husband or co-parent aside, go to co-parenting therapy, but don't have that relationship become dependent upon your involvement. And if it gets, again, I'll just be clear, if it gets to the point of abuse, you can step in if you need to. Create rituals with your children. You know, there are wonderful rituals like going camping, fishing, some of the more traditional ones. I did something with my son, I talk about this in the book, where I think that sometimes we think of therapy and just talk as the most important thing. Sometimes it's mentoring is better for young people. That's why in our program, so much of the value that happens in our program is with the field staff and your children, because they're more in a mentor role. And mentor roles are becoming more and more common in the treatment after wilderness of adolescents and young adults. And so taking your child to do tasks and to run errands. I even talk about in the book the grocery store lecture, where I used to take my son to go grocery shopping with me, and I would make one sentence, one point, one lecture, and then I would say, now would you go get some milk? The point is I wasn't going to drone on until his eyes glassed over. I wasn't going to beat him to death with it over and over again. I was just going to make my point. And it was funny because he would come back from getting the milk at times, the various things, and then he would start talking to me because there was time to digest it. I wasn't suffocating him with my lecturing, with my teaching and preaching. The crisis helps to correct flaws in communication and connection. Really, sometimes when you get to this point, it's the identified patient saying, this isn't working for me. I need something different in my family. And sometimes that is, I need something different from you, Dad. And so this crisis can be an indicator that things need to change between Dad, it's not always Dad, but between Dad and the child. Listening and vulnerability, I had that on about 5 of my slides this evening. It's the most important thing. Give them their dignity. You know, I learned that with my own children. I didn't do it well with the older ones early on. Sometimes I don't do well with the younger ones. Where I use my therapy skills, my x-ray vision, my adult mind to kind of ignore their boundaries and go right past it. Talk about their inner world that they're not ready to talk about. So it's okay if you know that they're not telling you everything. You can make your decision, have your boundaries based on what you know or what you suspect or what you feel. You don't have to know everything, and they don't have to tell you everything. The mentoring role versus the therapy role is a model for fathering, I think can be very effective. Sitting knee to knee to a child and asking probing questions might not be the best way to get to a child. That's why when we work with younger children, the model is play therapy, right? The model is activity. And you spend more time observing and then learning and understanding the child than you do by intervening. When I was a young play therapist, I was horrific at it because I was always intervening. And my supervisor was always pointing out to me that I was getting too far ahead of the child. Just listen, understand, give a voice to what's going on with them. Welcome their anger. My therapist said last week, and she used different words, which I won't repeat. She says, parenting starts right after the child says to the parent, screw you. That becomes the important test in parenting. How can you start to listen to your child's anger at you? I have on here Raising Cain as a reference. I would also give you Parenting from the Inside Out and The Anatomy of Peace and Leadership and Self-Deception as 4 excellent books that talk about general parenting skills that can apply to your child. All right, send in any live questions or comments. I asked folks at the beginning to send in comments, wisdom that they've gained along on their journey as a father. Let me read those that have come in. I have a couple that have come in. One father says, I've learned the importance of listening, not to try to control, to let my son make his own decisions and lead his own life. I've also learned the importance of staying in my circle. Most of all, I've learned to do my own work and to try not to let my family of origin issues impact my son. Thank you for teaching me these things, Brad. That almost brings a tear to my eye. Thank you for sharing that. Those are some of the points that I've been talking about tonight, right? And it can happen young, and it can happen old. It's never too late, never too early to start with these things. Another father says, I got nowhere with my son until I shut up about his behavior and let him live his life for himself. He needed me to stop trying to help him, and he needed time to get over his resentment toward me. I was there for him if I could be, but I abdicated a lot of my authority to allow him time to find a way for him to let me back in. I'm hearing a lot about showing up, and I see that I have to do it as consciously as the backing off that was employed for the last year and a half. I can see my son now, but this is still very difficult for me and for him. I want to say something to you. Thank you for writing that. I want to say to you this. Part of the way that you showed up and saw him was backing off. He was feeling crushed, overwhelmed, invasive feelings from you, smothered. He was feeling that. And so, in a way, and it's complex, isn't it? It's not just one way or one technique, but in a way, you did see him. And now you realize that there's also other pieces of this that you need to do. Oh, it goes on to say, here's the wisdom from someone who has been dealing with these issues for many years. What I've heard tonight has been difficult because I feel that I've been trying to be better for my son, but there's still so much work ahead of me. It's daunting, but I see that I have to attend to my new task, becoming conversant in the language of feeling scary. Well, thank you for sharing that. You know, what I've learned in my work, and I mean my personal work, not my education over the years, is that we can do this work without shame and guilt. You know, we can just do it because it's a better way of living. It's richer for us. We have more meaningful lives and we make more meaningful contributions to our children. And none of that I just said is about guilt and shame and mistakes. The more we can become comfortable with our human beingness, the more we can show up in this way. And so thank you, gentlemen, for the courage to share your experience, your wisdom, your struggle, the lessons that you've learned, and then the lessons you're still struggling with. All right, I'm going to go over some upcoming events and announcements, and then I'll leave it open to any questions. Pass in any questions or comments right now to Melanie, and she'll pass them on to me. We ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Alateen is for teens, adultchildren.org. If you grew up in a family that you felt was toxic, adultchildren.org can be a great meeting to go to. Refugerecovery.org it's a recovery program that de-emphasizes higher power, so if that's a barrier to you, you might try that. NAMI.org, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is a great resource in communities to go to get free resources and classes. On social media, you can listen to all of these broadcasts on any of your podcast apps. In fact, if you like a podcast app that we're not on, let us know and I'll get us on it. On iPhone or Android or computer, download the requisite app and then just search Evoke Therapy Programs. On Twitter and Instagram, follow us by using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or you can find us on @Evoke Summit Lodge on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Alumni Foundation is an organization built of parents who try to help people that can't afford therapy. Go to Facebook and search Evoke Family Foundation. Our blog is also available. My book is available on Amazon. Paperbacks are still available. The warehouse is out, but just click on the button beneath the paperback, the new option, and you can buy them directly from the Evoke warehouse. If you want to do deeper work, I would strongly implore you to attend to Finding You. I've done one myself. That's why I started these. I do one every year with a group of men, a version of these. So the next one is May 15th through 19th. It's a 4.5-day workshop to understand your past, your history, your childhood, and how it's impacting you today. We have a Finding You 2 coming up, June 9th through 13th. I'll be running that one this summer. You have to have participated in one of our intensives prior to go to Finding You 2. To learn more about these, go to our website or email us at intensives@evoketherapy.com. I'll be in London on May 1st, New York on May 13th, and Toronto on May 22nd for parent support groups. Contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. We ask all current parents to go to a workshop if you can. You can combine this with a visit to visit your child in the field if the therapist thinks the timing is right. The next one is May 18th and 19th in our Southern Utah program at our Entrada location. Again, contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits trips are adventure trips for young adults or families all over the world. Any kind of fun activity hosted by our wilderness staff that can help you Get in touch again with some of your therapy skills, tools, and insights. Think therapy light or sober fun. All right, any other questions that have come in? One parent writes, our 14-year-old is on day 1 at Evoke in Bend. We are looking forward to all the learning. How do we honor his interests when recently it has all been around pot? When is it okay to try and redirect? Honoring doesn't mean that you don't try and redirect and have boundaries. Honoring means you understand it. So you can do both at the same time. You can say, for example, tell me why you love pot. I want to understand. Tell me what it does for you. And I won't correct you when you tell me. I won't give you the speech about how it harms you right afterwards. When you say, it helps me to escape, it helps me to relax, you say, makes sense. I can understand that. And then sometimes you don't have to say anything right away at all. So honoring a defense is not abdicating responsibility for setting boundaries and having limits. It's having compassion and non-judgment toward the defense. It's understanding how the defense serves them. But that doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries and limits and consequences. So you can do both at the same time. In fact, it's ideal if you do both at the same time. Great question. And welcome to the program. And when I say welcome to the program, I mean the entire program. Another parent says, how do you balance backing off and not trying to make every conversation a lesson when there's still some unsafe activity that I feel I need to intervene with my 15-year-old son currently in the program? That's a very similar question to the last one. Boundaries, limits, consequences are the thing that does the teaching. When we respond with lecturing, anger, badgering, shame, I was just talking to some friends about this today. Their behavior is their behavior that needs attention, no doubt about it. Your frustrated, shaming, angry, lashing out is your problem. That's not their problem. And although, and I know, those can be effective in the short run for changing behavior, in the long run, we absolutely know how harmful those can be. So thanks for that. Another parent says, working on healthy attachment, detachment, as described in your book, has been a great help to me and has enabled a better relationship with my son. He's still struggling with his addiction, but there are glimpses of hope, and I know he's in God's hands. Thank you for that. You know, it's something I discovered actually by doing these, that healthy attachment and detachment are the same thing. In recovery literature and addiction literature, they really emphasize healthy detachment. They talk about that all the time. But it's the exact same thing as healthy attachment. Unhealthy attachment or unhealthy detachment is the same thing. And healthy attachment and healthy detachment is the same thing. The reason that they emphasize detachment is because we're all used to anxious attachment. And so when we detach some, it feels like abandonment. So that's why they use that word, is to emphasize that's how it's going to feel. But really, healthy detachment is getting closer to your child. Really, really important. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, no additional questions for tonight. Thank you for all your participation. Thanks to you fathers and mothers and co-parents who support them for joining us tonight. I'm going to be talking about the 4 agreements 2 nights from now, Thursday, April 25th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. So join me for that. Fantastic book, great concepts and principles, really accessible. I'll be talking about this Thursday at 7 p.m. Hope to join you. Hope you'll join me there. Again, I hope these points of contact are helpful for you folks. I hope you find the podcast available, a helpful way to access these. Please give us reviews there and share and subscribe there and get the word out, because those podcasts are free for everybody. And we think that they can be helpful to our community, our society at large. Thanks a lot for joining us, and I'll talk to you Thursday night. Bye-bye.